Putin, in his senseless war of aggression in Ukraine, has resurrected death and destruction on a scale not seen since World War II, bringing misery and violence to the heart of Europe in the 21st century. What myths and delusions led us to this point, and how can it be stopped? Today, I'm exploring these questions with Professor Dina Khapaeva. Welcome to Silicon Curtain Podcast. Please like and subscribe if you like the content we produce. Our material is now available also on popular podcasting apps as well, such as Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Dina Khapaeva is a professor at the School of Modern Languages at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She has also worked as Director of Research at the Smolny Institute in St. Petersburg. Dina's research and teaching interests lie on the intersection of cultural studies, memory studies, post-Soviet neo-medievalism, history of emotions, and death studies. Her most recent book project, The Celebration of Death in Russia and America, compares the way of engaging with death and representations of violent death in Russia and American popular culture. Welcome so much to the channel.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, before we dive into the issues, especially around the re-Stalinization of Russia, I'd love to learn a little bit more about your background and what led you into this area of research.
Thank you. Thank you for this question, Jonathan. Well, I actually got my PhD in St. Petersburg State University in the area of ancient Greek studies. Because that was their kind of the niche, the intellectual niche to escape from the dominant discourse. But after I got my PhD in 1989, it was already possible to do much more contemporary things. And I have always been very interested in their memories, how our society lives their memories of the crimes of Stalinist regime. And what I was interested, especially at that time, back in the late 80s, early 90s, is how this memory, how does it function in contemporary society? What impact can it have? And does it has any impact on the changes their post-Soviet society underwent in the early 90s and on? My feeling that time was that insufficient working through the past, the Theodor Adorno, to use Theodor Adorno term, could create a sort of a lot of problems for democratization of Russia. And I've been publishing on this subject since early 1990s. And unfortunately, I believe this is what we are witnessing now. The fact that at that time, back in the early 90s, the Russian intelligentsia and the Russian Democrats decided, instead of kind of working through this horrible past, they decided to start building Russia, as the expression of the time was, kind of starting from the zero ground, building Russia from scratch, a new society, a new country. And although this feeling is very well understood, I think it was a huge mistake that liberal and democratic forces allowed themselves to that they committed at this period of time, not to speak about, of course, communists and nationalist forces that considered and continue to consider what happened under Stalin a kind of normal and even heroic part of Russian history.
And so what we've ended up, sorry.
No, that's how I have been interested in this issue for many years.
And of course, just before we came on the recording, you were telling me a bit about the Smolny Institute, which was one of the first liberal institutions. And I imagine looking at issues of the past, memory, the repressions under Stalin's period. I mean, where you were working and what you were studying, there must have been a fairly open attitude to these things, not necessarily, however, reflected by other institutions and in society and the media.
Yes, my husband, Nikolai Kopasov, he is also a historian. He was the founding dean of Smolny Institute, and I was director of research. Smolny Institute was the first liberal arts college in Russia, created jointly by Bard College of New York and St. Petersburg State University. So the whole idea of this project was to offer Russians a new educational model, which would enable us and the students to create a kind of a democratic educational system, which is very different from traditional Russian system, much influenced by kind of 19th century German university, which is professor-centered, huge classes, and so on and so forth. So Smolny was built on the model of American liberal arts education. We believed at that time that Smolny would allow us to help students become democratically oriented citizens of Russia. The education was very much student-centered, and critical thinking was completely central to everything what we have done. And yes, of course, I lectured on, I taught classes on Stalinist memories of Stalinism in post-Soviet Russia, and on the topics of my research.
And of course, in the 90s, there were liberal voices within the government, and right up until, I think, the middle of the 2000s. But it's really in the era of economics, isn't it, that you had more liberal influence, far less influence in say, sort of cultural and historical liberal views.
Well, you're right in the sense that if you think about people like, state leaders like Yegor Gaidar, for example, for majority of those people, despite the fact that they hated Marxism, for many of them, the idea that economy really drives society, this kind of economical determinism, which is very central to Marxism, was also very central to their thinking. So they sort of felt that, and many Western experts supported those ideas at the time, that once you build the market economy, democracy just follows, which was a complete delusion, of course. I would say that in the 90s, there were basically two periods when Russia was completely open democratic country in its entire history. That was starting from February 17th to October 17th, then the provisional government created really a space of democratic sort of freedoms in Russia. And also the 90s were there another period then, despite all kind of, economic crimes, corruption, and, just street banditism, there were a lot of negative features, of course, at this period. But in terms of freedom, it was the only kind of period of 10 years when Russia was completely liberal. You could have published whatever you want, say whatever you want, do whatever you want. It was a period of democracy in Russia. And that's why Mr. Putin hates it so much. And a lot of Putin's mythology is based on the idea that 90s were the horrible times, and Mr. Putin just single-handedly helped Russia out of this horrible, horrible period.
Now, your studies of the re-Stalinization of society, I'd love to explore that more, because I'd love to know the sort of dynamic of that, what's been resurrected, what hasn't. But based on the research you've done there, did it come as a surprise to you that he launched a full-scale war in Ukraine, or do you think that was almost an inevitable outcome of the re-Stalinization policies he's been following?
It was an inevitable outcome. It's like in this famous Chekhov's play, their gun that hangs on the wall, one, will inevitably shoot at some point. The same, this restalinization. I mean, Putin started this campaign, and we can talk a little bit more later, if you like, about how, just about the historical kind of moments, how this campaign was organized. He launched it the moment he became acting president. And even before, he was very active in promoting it. I would like to say that restalinization has been extremely important for militarizing post-Soviet society. Militarization was absolutely central for Putin's ideology and for the whole myth, what I call the myth of the Second World War. And then I say the myth of the Second World War. I'm not suggesting, of course, that the Second World War didn't exist, or was a myth and not a historical event, or that people didn't suffer during this period of time. But unfortunately, the historical memory of this very traumatic event has been utilized by Putin in such a way as to lead the Russian population believe that today that, heroic Ukrainian president Vladimir Zelensky of Jewish origin is a Nazi and leads the Nazi regime in Ukraine, and that Ukrainian people needs to be help me.
Denazified, yes.
Denazified, thank you.
And de-Satanized, if you believe the latest propaganda as well.
De-Satanized, yeah, but let's just, this kind of second part, probably let's bracket it for now, because part of my research is also has to do with this neo-medievalism and how neo-medieval thinking actually influenced Putin's regime and Putin's propaganda. But I think it's just let's just
deal with the Stalin period first. Yes.
Yeah.
So when did it really? So you say he started right from the beginning, and I think very early on in his regime, they resurrected the Soviet anthem, and that was a bit of a red flag, obviously. But that has been accelerating. What are the other milestones in this sort of echoes of Stalinism being resurrected?
Well, their Soviet anthem, that was not even their first kind of significant step taken by Putin. Already in 1999, at the gathering, I love this quote, and I just give it to you because I think our viewers need to know this. On December 20th in 1999, at the gathering of the KGB High Command to mark the day of the Chekist, which is the anniversary of the KGB, founded in 1917 by Lenin and Felix Dzerzhinsky. Putin, then the prime minister, delivered a speech in which he reported that, and now I quote, a group of FSB agents assigned to go undercover and infiltrate the government of the Russian Federation has completed its first round of task. So he is still prime minister, and this is what he says in one of very important kind of speeches. In February 2000, Putin, then acting president, visited the war memorial at Mamayev Kurgan in Volgograd and met with war veterans there. That was also a very significant event. I will skip the details, what was discussed there, But after his visit definitely inspired several local calls to rename the city Stalingrad, as it was under Stalin. And those calls has been tabled, since then regularly by the Volgograd City Council and the Communist Party to the State Duma. In December of the same year, Putin created, as you mentioned, this music of the Soviet national anthem. And Sergei Mikhalkov, who created the music for the Stalinist anthem, then recreated it in 1970s to kind of a little bit different tone. And now he was called on to do the same for the Soviet anthem. So it's all those things are extremely significant, but it's nothing to compare to the memory to the Victory Day celebrated on May 9th in 2000. Then Putin, already president, elected, he was technically elected president in March 2000 and inaugurated in May 2000. So under his leadership, there was the first military parade on Red Square that brought back memories of Soviet parades. This didn't happen under Yeltsin. Nothing of the kind existed before Putin came to power. And that was the first kind of really significant sign of restalinization campaign. And coming back to your question about the current war in Ukraine, this was the kind of starting first step towards militarization of the country.
It would also suggest that if he was an agent in 1999, it would also suggest that he had never retired his position within that agency, and that while he was working in the mayor's office in St. Petersburg under Anatoly Sobchak, it would suggest that that was also part of the mission. Now, it is alleged that vast amounts of money and funds and material were stolen at that point, obviously under the direction of Putin. It's also been alleged that there were close connections between some of the largest crime syndicates in St. Petersburg at the time, and that Putin in some way was the liaison between I guess the early version of the Siloviki or the local government and those criminal elements. And for anyone who lived in St. Petersburg in the 90s, it was probably the most corrupt, the most mafia-ridden and violent place in all of Russia. And Putin was really at the heart of that. But at the same time, potentially still working for the FSB or KGB.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you know, Marina Salye was head of their Duma commission that investigated Putin's economic crimes in 1992. Putin was relying heavily on a young jurist from St. Petersburg State University at this time called Dmitry Medvedev. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that of 9 members of this commission headed by Salye, none of them were old enough to die, but they all died. None of them.
Yes, and not always in very clear circumstances, I'm guessing.
Yes, and not of old age, clearly.
And this is something else we see. I know it's a little bit off topic, but we also see since February a huge amount of executives in the oil and especially gas sectors also meeting rather extraordinary and untimely ends. And we can only assume that either it's resistance or even just knowledge of what's taken place.
Yeah, I mean, this is what they call, what is correctly called pointed terror, which Putin unleashes in the country, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, because this is what attracts media attention. We just know little about what happens, on the lower echelons, so to say, of power. But yes, it's definitely not at the scale of Stalinism at this point. But if you look at the amount of people killed already in Ukraine, and even the Russian casualties of war, that's already a huge, huge scale of, crimes which has been committed by this regime.
I mean, we're definitely on a fast track to the 1930s, and in some ways, what was happening in Belarus under Lukashenko was always sort of a few months ahead of what was happening in Russia, or 6 months or a year or so. And we saw, Stalin-style terror already being unleashed in 2019, 2020, and the brutal suppression of the protests there. And many in Russia, I mean, I watch a lot of video blogs and so on, many of them even then refused to believe that Russia was on the same track as Belarus. That could never happen here. We're different. We would never put up with that. And yet the gap between Lukashenko repression and repression in Russia, that gap has now perhaps narrowed to a point where it's no longer significant.
I look at it a little different.
Mm-hmm.
What is Belarus on the world scale? Who is interested in, economic ties? What kind of market does it represent? Russia was a huge market for the Western companies. Oil and gas, and, my personal opinion is that leaders of Western democracies that made Europe dependent on Russian oil and gas should be tried after this war ends, as war criminals, as people responsible for their, putting Europe in such a dependence on Russia. I look a little kind of different on those differences, because Belarus was not an important market for the Western companies, and also not a nuclear power to be appeased, or a huge market to be explored and exploited. So the crimes against, the democracy, and their crimes against violations of human rights in Belarus were followed much closer and scrutinized much more efficiently by the Western observers, media, politicians, than it was the case of Putin's regime. I mean, let's not forget that there was the blast of Moscow apartment buildings, which brought Putin to power, and which allowed him to start creating his authoritarian regime. Let's not forget about Nordost, which was another act of terrorism, and we still don't know how it happened, why there were so many casualties after this operation. What was it? But yet it played another kind of it was another tool in the hands of Putin to start sort of, creating more, sort of advancing the authoritarian regime in Russia.
And Beslan as well, of course. Beslan, which famously brought Margarita Simonyan to the upper levels of journalism.
Absolutely. And we are not talking here about just, negligible, kind of offenses against some person. It's a lot of people who died in this accidents, and that would be plenty to kind of term Lukashenko, for example, a criminal terrorist regime. Well, somehow it didn't happen to Putin. And it didn't happen, to my mind, not because those crimes were not committed, unknown to the West, not to speak about, those famous poisoning, medieval poisoning of, Putin's opponents, starting from Litvinenko and,
Skripal. And,
Skripal, ending up Skripal and, several other cases. Why was it not scrutinized so much as it was the case of Belarus? For those two reasons. Because some Western politicians and some Western business people collaborated with Putin's regime and felt comfortable doing that and profitable. Let's not forget about that. While Lukashenko was much, much less important.
And turning to the Stalinization process, which I think is at the heart of this. Unlike communism, I mean, communism had a period of, let's say, popular support, but by the 1970s and 80s, I think very few people believed in that system. They existed within it, but they operated, I mean, you'd know potentially sort of living there, you'd have your own personal life, you'd know what was true and false for you. And this isn't an ideology that you'd necessarily get passionate about. You just had to put up with it and pretend, put your public face on. Is the re-Stalinization different? Does that have genuine popular support, or is it another ideology imposed from the top down?
That's an excellent question. Thank you for paying attention to this. Yes, restalinization is driven in some very important sense by the popular support. If you look, for example, at the monuments to Stalin, you have, by different counts, depending whether you count small villages, big towns, but since 2000, since Putin came to power, there is a rise of Stalin's monument all across Russia, in places like Mirny, Sochi, Vitebsk, in several small Russian cities and towns. There are plenty of monuments to Stalin, newly erected by the local citizens. Very often they're kind of masked as personal, private initiatives. But those private personal initiatives are often supported by the local authorities. Not to speak about, of course, KPRF, the communist, Russia's Communist Party, which calls now Stalin the saint, and which promotes at every possible occasion the idea that a new monument to Stalin should be erected and tables those proposals to Duma. So yes, that's restalinization is a movement which relies upon popular support. And let's not forget, Putin's regime is a right-wing populism. It's a right-wing populist regime, which is extremely dangerous precisely because it drives in and attracts quite considerable masses of population.
And of course, it's far more right-wing in its resurrection of a patriarchal, religion-centered nationalism. It's far more right-wing than, say, Zelensky's Ukraine.
Oh my God, I mean, why would you call Zelensky's Ukraine right-wing? I mean, I would never call it right-wing. I think what Ukraine does now to the world, and I believe a lot of people share this opinion, it just defends democracy. I mean, if Putin is allowed to take over Ukraine and all those appeasement talks, horrible appeasement talks that are going on here in the United States at the moment, and kind of diminishing popular support for their American government support of the Ukraine, if those appeasement talk allowed to happen, and if Ukraine is given to Putin, it will be the end of the existing international system, and I believe that will be the end of democracy. So Ukraine is fighting for our future, not only our future in Russia, our future in America, our future in the UK. And it's, to me, Ukraine is showing in a very interesting way, Ukraine is showing the West the value of democracy, because in the United States, as much as in Britain, criticism of contemporary democracy, which is very often justified. I mean, this system is not perfect. We all remember Churchill's famous phrase about it, right? But it's the best system which we have. And sort of dismissive criticism of democracy, which is going on now in the West, Ukraine demonstrates how precious democracy is, how important democracy is, and fighting for the cause of democracy, then kind of majority of many Western intellectuals and politicians become kind of disappointed and show disregard and disrespect for democratic values. So I believe it's just extremely important to understand what role Ukraine plays in contemporary politics. It's not just about Ukrainian independence, it's about independence of all of us.
And there are many countries in the West, Britain and America especially, but also Spain, France, Hungary, and others, and especially Serbia, that have shown that we have, because of our internal divisions, our arguments with ourselves about our political system and our left-right point of views, and that kind of estrangement that we've seen over the last few years, we've shown that actually we're vulnerable to active measures. We're vulnerable to Russian propaganda methodologies. And in fact, many, I would say, sort of bad actors on the hard left and the hard right in both the US and the UK have started to adopt, in some ways, the technology of Russian propaganda. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, and how dangerous is this?
I think it's extremely dangerous because it undermines the very idea of democracy, the very premises of democracy. I mean, there's sort of forces both on the right and on the left call for violence in both cases. They call for disrespect of individual rights and for disrespect of political opinions of their opponents, which is extremely dangerous. I mean, this is not democracy. This is not the democratic system. Luckily, you know, in the US, they have the First Amendment, which is, for example, was a big reason for my family and me to immigrate in the United States, because we felt like that democracy is best protected by constitution in this country. But so it's extremely dangerous and very frustrating and disappointing to see to what extent this kind of populist criticism of democracy this tries to sort of undermine the very foundations of this political and social system.
Now, it can't have come as any surprise to you, though, when Echo Moskwy and Dost was shut down, and when the foreign agent laws drove the few remaining sort of journalists and commentators out of the country or to jail, as in the case, of course, as Kara-Murza and Ilya Yashin. But what were your feelings when Memorial was suppressed? And, you know, to those who perhaps don't know, Memorial was the organization that helped to keep the historical record of Stalin's terror alive.
Well, that was the kind of the last stroke of Putin's regime in preparation for the war in Ukraine. We've been watching this horror from here, from the United States, their huge attack on opposition that started in 2020 and went on full blast in 2021. We felt that this is what's they're doing this. They're kind of, you know, doing this to Navalny organization. They're kind of going after Memorial and closing it precisely because they need no opposition in the country in preparation for the war. But you see, before what my kind of the important kind of thesis or important idea for me is that restalinization shouldn't be looked at as a sudden shift in, Putin's politics, or is a recent phenomenon. It was a memory politics or politics of history that he developed starting from the first days of his presidencies, as we discussed, and consistently implemented throughout his entire past 20 years. So the brainwashing of the post-Soviet, of Putin's subjects, has not started, like 2 years ago. It has been for 20 years a consistent campaign which tried to implant, and was quite successful in some sense, to implant in the minds of Russians the idea that because they victoriously sort of defended the world from their outmost evil, which is fascism, so everybody who is against Russia now, everyone who speaks against Russia interests, is also a Nazi. And this is how, following this logic, Ukraine, which didn't want to be part of Russia or didn't want to lose its, economic, political independence to Russia, this is how it was called, by Putin's propaganda. This is how it became, in their kind of twisted minds, a Nazi regime.
And as well as, I would say, sort of perverting or manipulating history, how have they institutionalized this? So what effect is this having on the education system, on culture, film, and the sort of ecosystem in which the youth are brought up? Are they also weaponizing education in order to inculcate these values?
That's once again an excellent question. The Putin's regime and Putin personally has started being very much interested in history education back in 2006. Then he had his first meeting with the school teachers in Nova Ogareva, and like right after that, very discussing how their Soviet citizens and Soviet children need a positive view on history. Let's forget about this all kind of criminalization of our wonderful Russian past. And shortly after that, Alexander Filipov published, well, it was not published, but the kind of preliminary version of his history textbook for the school teachers. That was a kind of an instrument to educate how teachers should teach the history of Russia, was sort of made public. At this textbook, Stalin was called, at this first draft, which later was removed from their final text, Stalin was called an effective manager. And the whole idea was that Stalinist repressions, they were not probably laudable, but actually they were necessary because they helped modernize the country. And without them, Russia would never win the Second World War and, destroy this fascism. So this textbook started that published in 2007. That started a completely new era in their relationships between Russian state and education. Stalinist propaganda in film, literature, and fiction is absolutely huge and is state-supported. There has been so many films and TV series, state-supported, in this or that shape or form, that promoted the image of Stalin and his regime. But what I would like to emphasize is not even this kind of massive visual and propaganda, but also to what extent their propaganda of Stalin's personality, but to what extent their rehabilitation of terror, of Stalinism as a regime has been important for Putin. I mean, there has been constant attempts to represent repressions as in Filipov's way. I mean, by the way, Filipov, who is a historian, was completely unknown to the historical profession before he published this textbook. He was nobody from nowhere, manager of Putin's presidential campaign, and had no credentials to be the historian to educate, the nation. I have my doubts about the authorship of this textbook. I believe that Alexander Dugin, who also proposed the textbook, but his textbook was not accepted. Maybe Filipov is just a pen name for Dugin, because this textbook advocated for neo-Eurasian ideology and ideas in a very, very close way to Dugin's ideology.
Could we unpack that? Because this concept of Eurasianism and other phrases that Lavrov and others use all the time, like multipolarity, these concepts really are not well known amongst the public. And we don't really, when we hear these terms, we don't think they have any importance. But there does seem to be a far more ideologically driven direction, doesn't there, in Putin's regime? If the first half of his regime was less concerned with sort of, ideologically driven concepts, and it was just more pragmatic, certainly the second half of his rule seems to be driven in far more ideological ways. Could you unpack those two concepts and what's their importance?
Yeah, but first of all, let me just say that early on in his regime, the ideology started to play a really, really important role. That starts from his second term, especially, and because they're all kind of extreme right, kind of right-wing populists in the Russian political spectrum, they just started jumping on Putin's administration, offering their ideas and ideology. And it happened because after the collapse of the Soviet regime, there was clearly an ideological background. And then Putin came to power. We shouldn't sort of demonize him. They shouldn't think of him like Napoleon, a great state leader or something. He and his crooks had no ideology and no idea no vision for the future. They still don't have it, but they can come back later to this issue. So at some point they felt that, the Orthodox Church will fill this ideological vacuum for the regime. They were about stealing. They were crooks. They were not about creating. It was not like Adolf Hitler, who kind of in his completely criminal way felt about 1,000-year Reich and God knows what else. Those guys, they're completely different, completely empty-minded insofar as any ideology is concerned. So then there's kind of wild Russian nationalists started to offering them easy concept, easy to grasp by their kind of criminal minds. That's in this very kind of initial point of Putin's reign. This is how his ideology started to sort of form. Alexander Dugin, the leader of this new Eurasian movement, was among the first to jump on this moving wagon, and did it to a big success. I mean, New Eurasianism is an ideology which claims that Russia should return to their pre-Petrine times, to the times before Peter I started westernization of Russia in 17th century. So the whole idea is that Russia should get back to their traditional kind of society, monarchy, and is ideal way for the Russians to be governed. Society of the states is the best form of social organization for Russia. Democracy is evil, and it's a fruit of this sort of Western ideology that should be completely sort of washed away. And conquest of the rest of the world under their banners of the Orthodox religion, which is, according to them, the only true religion, and should be definitely shared with the rest of their happy humanity. That's basically what this ideology is about. But Neo-Eurasianism, and Dugin is, despite his huge influence on the Kremlin's ideology, he is not alone in thinking in those terms. And that's why I introduced this concept of neo-medievalism to the post-Soviet studies. And I believe that this neo-medievalist trend has been extremely important also in Putin's memory politics. Basically, restalinization needs to be understood through the lenses of neo-medievalism, because another big hero of Putin and Dugin and people around the Kremlin is Ivan the Terrible. And Ivan the Terrible is such a huge hero, not only because he created what they started to create their Russian Empire, but precisely because he introduced the first regime of the state terror in Russia called the Oprichnina, which is favorably compared to Stalinism. And for those people, for the Russian right-wing ideologists, both Stalinism and the Oprichnina are examples how the Russian society should be ruled. And Dugin, for example, and his Neo-Eurasian movement are great, very fond of the Oprichnina, Ivan the Terrible, Stalin, and Stalinism, and claim that this is what future beholds for Russia.
And that strikes me, it's like a tyranny in search of an idea. You know, it's not a tyranny to serve an idea, it's tyranny that has no idea except the pursuit of power and, as you say, sort of wealth. And it's looking for some kind of almost intellectual justification for its existence.
Absolutely. And they find this justification in the most kind of primitive concept, which is terror. I mean, what is less more primitive than that? The sheer cult of force, the sheer idea that you can just, dump the society back to the 16th century or 15th century, and, just control it by sheer terror. I would like to mention something in relation to Dugin and Neo-Eurasianism. There has been a huge debate in the field of post-Soviet studies whether he is influential or not, whether Dugin is marginal or not. And I think that the current events show very clearly that Dugin and those right-wing nationalists are extremely influential in Kremlin, have always been. He has been, and people, other kind of trends of Russian nationalists influenced the Kremlin's politics very considerably over the past at least 15 years.
And of course, if they don't quote Dugin, because they know that that'll be controversial in the West, they quote lesser-known people like Gumilev and Ilya Ilyin, but they come from the same toxic pool of ideas, don't they?
Yes, absolutely. Although it's the rumors has it that the rumors have it that it's most likely that Ilyin was introduced to Putin by Dugin, but Dugin himself claimed to be this kind of neo-eurasianist before he read Ilyin, it looks like, and also before he acquired any knowledge of Gumilev, of Lev Gumilev. So that's kind of a sort of fabricated, post hoc fabricated genealogy. But yes, you are completely right. And very recently in one of his speeches, Putin again quoted Ilyin. Ilya Ilyin was a Russian white guard emigre who immigrated to Paris after the revolution and who created an openly fascist ideology. I mean, that was an idea that Russia should kind of dominate the world and so on and so forth. But at the same time, he was great admirer of Hitler and very open admirer of Hitler. He praised Hitler, he praised Hitlerism and Nazism, and believed Nazism was a wonderful system. And it's not something that you need to go to archives to find out about. That's in his writings, which were published back in the time, back in the 30s, 40s. Putin transferred his ashes, the ashes of Ilya Ilyin, to St. Petersburg, and Putin recommended his works to their state officials. So it's not just, he quoting him like, that's a Russian fascist ideology on which Putin's regime relies on.
I've got two more questions. I know we're running a little bit short on time.
Yeah, but if I may just add this, it's very important to understand Putin's Kremlin's propaganda. It's very important to understand that the very moment they feel they are guilty of something, they immediately blame it on their opponents. This is what's going on. They feel, they know they are fascists. They admire fascism because of, terror and terrorist regime to which they feel very close to. And of course, this is how and why Ukraine, that they want to conquer, became Nazi.
It's a pure projection. And of course, choosing this ideology is a choice. I mean, some in the West will not quite understand. They'll think that somehow these are a set of organic ideas that are natural to adopt, but they're a complete fabricated choice, aren't they? Because another regime in Russia has other models on which to base its ideology. It could look to the February Revolution, as you mentioned earlier. It could look to 1905. It could look to the Decembrists, or it could even look back to the Novgorodian Republic that was wiped out by Ivan the Terrible. There are other models for future Russian democratic ideas and ideals.
Let me say something to this. I agree with you, there are other models. And in the 1990s, after the collapse of communism, it felt like Russia has chosen a democratic, pro-Western ideology and model of development. Well, unfortunately, it didn't last. I have been writing for a long time about the causes why this pro-Western democratic ideology collapsed in Russia in the 1990s. But what I wanted to mention in reaction to what you've just said is that I believe what is very important to understand is that, of course, you're right, and there has been a different there is a different tradition to which Russia can inspire for democracy, and the collapse of the communism actually showed a different way opened up a different way for Russia to follow the Western model, the democratic model, and it was at some point it was a hope that Russia will really become a democratic country. Unfortunately, it didn't happen, and I have been sort of investigating there and writing about the reasons why their West-oriented democratic ideology collapsed in the 1990s. But you see, I believe that your question implied that contemporary Russia as it is now, can inspire for the democratic future. And I really don't think so. I do believe that Russia as a state, in its current borders as it exists now, should not continue existing. Russia represents a colonial power at the moment. If you look at who is thrown into their, this carnage of the war, those are not Russians. Majority of them are ethnic people from Tuva, Buryatia, all other kind of non-Russian nations. I believe that many of those people would like to become independent. And I think that the only way Russia can, or something, some unit, some country which will remain after contemporary Russia will go through the process of decolonization. This process of decolonization is the only hope for Russia to become a democratic country.
Mm. And my last question really relates back to the war and to your concept of neo-medievalism, because I think one of the other key characteristics that has really been thrown into sharp contrast during the war is the attitude towards individual life, the value that an individual human life has. We see that Ukraine is much closer to the Western concept. Each individual is mourned, cared for in life and death, and valued as an individual. And we see a total contempt. People are treated as nothing more than material or cannon fodder, pushna miasa in the sort of Russian phrase there. Does this relate back also to this idea of neo-medievalism and the value placed on human life is very different from the modern world?
That's absolutely true, and thank you for raising this question. Yes, indeed. The Russian neo-medievalists and the Russian ideologists, they want Russia to get back to medieval times. Their kind of major goal is to dismantle this, what they consider Western concept of individualism. They believe that individual life shouldn't matter, that the only goal of an individual is to serve society and live or die at the order of the Tsar or, dictator who is on top of the system. And you are absolutely right. The key idea of this whole neo-medievalist movement is to dismantle democracy. Dismantle democracy as a system which protects individual rights of people, which protects human rights. They don't value, they put no sort of value in human life. And this is precisely what they observe in Russia. And you are very right pointing at that in Ukraine, it's completely different. Also, it's very different how Vladimir Zelensky treats his soldiers and how much he is in the front lines compared to Mr. Putin, who is never out of his bunker.
And we've seen videos of Zelensky meeting the widows and the children of soldiers, going to the front line, of course. And it's a much more sort of popular democratic profile. Of course, there's always going to be media and spin, but there seems to be a genuine connection and trust.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, Zelensky is a democratic president. It cannot be otherwise in Ukraine at the moment, because this is Ukrainian people who are fighting for their independence, for their future, for their democracy. If you like, he just incarnates the spirit of his country, and he behaves in the way society expects him to behave. And vice versa. In Russia, the problem, this Putinism, is that this undistinguished individual, Mr. Putin, who had no qualities and no character to become what he is at the moment. For many Russians, they look at him and think, I would behave in the same way if I were in his shoes, so to say. That's why he is in the bunker, because many of those people who admire him would also do everything to protect his personal or her personal life, instead of sort of supporting his fighting nation. So I really think that the way to dismantle Putinism and to dismantle this regime, it should be military defeated. Their appeasement talks, which President of France, the country I love, Monsieur Macron, constantly offers, is the horrible strategy, because you cannot negotiate this Putin, you cannot trust what he tells you, and every attempt to stop, to prevent Ukraine from winning this war would lead only to the conservation of this regime, its kind of internal sort of restructuring, and the next step of this regime would be another war, but probably much better prepared.
Well, Dina, I could keep talking for hours. I think there's so much more to explore. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but it's been a huge pleasure speaking to you. It's been incredibly insightful, and hopefully we'll get the chance to talk again, because I know I still have a million questions to ask, but I'm very grateful to you for spending time today.
Jonathan, thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure and very insightful for me too.